Greetings, gamers, and welcome to the 40-second live stream from the Studios. I am your host, Vortex, and this is D&D Discussions. I have Kage in the studio with me today for our topic about creating creating homebrew as DMs or for DMs. And normally we have talked a lot about creating homebrew, how we create it in terms of the ideas of balancing for the situation, but what we really haven't talked about a lot is the propagation of the butterfly effect in our settings and how we place new ideas into our settings and how we go about looking at those effects and deciding how exactly the best way is to implement it into our setting and allow those effects to take positive action instead of undoing a lot of things that we may have already decided. So it's going to be a really interesting topic. I was really excited to come up with this one. So I'm going to bring Kage in, and then we're going to get right into our topic today. Bam. How's it going, my friend?
Doing all right. How's it going?
It's been an interesting week. I've had the last 2 days off, so it's been pretty relaxing. Nice 5-day weekend for me.
I don't understand why they can't just universalize when people get days off. So it's not like I went to go get lunch today. I didn't want to talk about this. I went to go get lunch today, and it was worse than going to the mall. There were so many people at freaking Chick-fil-A today.
You're gonna have to re-say all of that because your mic wasn't. I think you might have been on, but it definitely wasn't great.
It wasn't picking me up.
Yeah,
that's fun.
That's my bad.
Whatever, it's cool. Just a little rage about too many people out on the road.
Yeah, too many people.
It's all
too
right.
many people.
It's all good.
But we are back with our topic. Yes, so interesting enough, we've talked a lot about home brewing. We've discussed a lot about how we homebrew. We've even homebrewed live.
Yeah.
But what we really don't talk a lot about is the behind the curtains, what's going on behind the scenes when we do these homebrews. And I don't necessarily mean the homebrew reviews that we've done for the audience, but when we create things for our realm, obviously, or at least, for High Point, for the Cineverse, it's interesting to talk about because a lot of the times we talk about what we created as if it were a long time ago. And a lot of those things we did create when we first created our settings, when we first started, deciding to be DMs. A lot of the things, like my Deceptor class was, created years ago. And we talked about, the evolution of High Point recently in the Origins of High Point series that we did. And those are all great when they're being implemented into the early stages. But what we haven't really gone off is yes, we've created new things to implement into our settings and how they would affect, say, an encounter or how they would affect a player's gameplay. And we've talked about how to balance out that, right? Whether it's balanced for attack, for combat, whether it's balanced for progression in gameplay and plot device. But when you create that item and you gave it to them, it's one thing to say, I'm putting this item into my world and it's being created at the time I'm putting it in. That's one thing. And that's great, right? You want to create an item that a deity created or a character created. Those are fine. Those are easy because you're implementing them at the time of their creation. But what about ideas that you want to have had in your realm? New ideas that you're discovering, new things that you're creating,
yes,
that you now want to have had as your past. That is something I think is a little bit more complicated because you could just DM it. You could just do the DM thing and say, well, it is what it is. I want it there. So it's always been there.
Yes.
But for DMs like us who want those reasons, we want that history. And it's not that we have, pages and pages and paragraphs of every single thing we've ever created, but it has to fit.
Yes.
And that's really what I wanted to talk about today.
I think a large part of that is when I am a player, one of the big things that I look for is consistency, right? It's that you know, we talk a lot about wanting to get into our characters, but like when you have players that are coming back to your game regularly, it's nice to know that like I'm coming back to the same game I played last week, right?
Or the
And
same setting, at least.
and it feels like the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the times when it's just like, oh, I saw this new cool thing, so we're gonna start doing this instead. By the way, it changes like everything, like about how the game works and like all of that
Right.
stuff. You just have to deal with it. Like,
Or you're like, hey, by the way, I just discovered this new item that I read about. So the NPC you met that you've been traveling with, he secretly had this item the whole time. And then you're like, wait a minute, based off my character's story and this power, I should have been able to sense that every single time I use this ability, and I never did. Like that's
Yes.
that's a better idea of saying it undoes all of the mechanics, you know. But something like that, saying that you've been running with an NPC, they suddenly find a new weapon that's, let's say it's like an infernal weapon, and you're you're a holy type of cleric or a paladin, and you use detect evil, or you have something that would have detected the presence of this cursed object. So for the DM to finally say that that NPC that you've been hanging around with this whole time, yeah, he's had this cursed dagger this whole time, and it's like, wait a minute, that you know what I mean? Like you have to retcon some things.
Yeah.
You have to you have to take a lot of things for granted, and I think that's what we're talking about. Is we've never really talked about what steps do we take to not allow that to happen, or at least what steps do we take that we want to do in order to make something historically created, even though it's a brand new idea. And I actually talked to you about one that I just recently created today. So funny enough, I just created something today. I texted Kage about it earlier, and that's kind of what spawned this topic. I was like, I started thinking about it. I'm like, this is a cool thing. And all I did was I basically texted him a picture, and it was pretty self-explanatory. It takes like 3 sentences to explain what it does. But what I started realizing is I wanted this to not be a brand new item. It's not like I wanted this to be created in present day High Point. This is now something that made sense to have been in High Point, but I ran into a couple challenges. How does that work? How do you just say something's been forever there without worrying about the consequences and without questioning, well, if it was always here, why wasn't it used this time? So that's kind of what I want to talk about, is the thought process I went through creating this item. And it really does kind of umbrella the ideas that I go through when I create something new, but it's meant to be in High Point throughout different stages. So I just, that butterfly effect propagation.
Very much so.
And that propagation isn't just regionally, right? It's not like who created it and how many people had access to it. It's the propagation of, I came up with it today, but how does that propagate through High Point's history? And what does that affect? But I do want to get to chat real quick because we do have Cosmic in the chat as always, right on time.
Of course.
Lovely to see you, Cosmic. Would the plan I posted in the Discord count as a homebrew, since it's having a non-holy caster use the ability normally only usable by holy caster? See, I don't think I would qualify that as homebrew. And the reason why is because, again, so preface this with anybody who's new, or if you haven't seen my other YouTube videos. By the way, YouTube has been completely updated. I finally got to it. All episode titles have been updated properly, and I have playlists. So there are a ton of playlists. We popped that into the Discord. Would you mind?
Most definitely.
But yeah, we did update the Discord. We and did an announcement today. So the YouTube channel is finally looking a lot better and a lot easier to navigate. So if you want to see a previous High Point live stream, they're all there in their own playlist and properly titled to better understand what we were talking about. So to give a preference, because this is a great question, Cosmic, and I want to give the history real quick. So I still to this day have a hard time. Like, the reason why I'm embracing Mondays as homebrew review, not just because I love the topic, I love listening to what people are doing, but also embracing the title, also really like embracing it called homebrew review, is I've for a long time had a hard time with the term homebrew. And that's just because the history that I had with the term, originally it was, I don't want to say derogatory, but it usually came with a negative connotation.
Yeah.
Most of the time when I was early on in gaming, homebrew basically was unauthorized, or it was looked down upon because it was just stuff you made up. And most people didn't give it a lot of like your stories are one thing, right? The setting, the stories, people didn't worry too much about that. But when you wanted to start like creating brand new races and creatures and things like that, or even getting breaking the rules too much of the book, people would start calling that homebrew because they were trying to separate it from their protected little gem of a game. And that happens in a lot of games, but I remember specifically there was an era at which it really inflicted like the people that I knew that played D&D, and it just was really hard because anything termed homebrew was basically just like ignored. It was like
Right.
it was like using a magic card that was no longer in the acceptable brackets.
Nobody was allowed to use it. It was banned or something like that.
So it's like you could have this whole great deck, but if it had half the deck was from an old series that no one that no one was current with,
right,
they wouldn't let you use it. So
exactly.
So that's where I came from in terms of homebrew. And eventually I looked at the idea always from D&D, from the original books, that it was meant to be something that you expanded upon. These were just ideas to start with, and they were meant to expand. If you looked at the book and said, "Oh, a dagger does a 1d4 damage," but you're like, "Yeah, but I want a specific dagger to do 1d6." There's nothing stopping you. But the idea that people had in their head, like, no, but it's a dagger. If you want it to do 1d6, it has to be a short sword, right? Like, that was a short-mindedness that I couldn't understand. And just wasn't the game that I understood, right? And it wasn't like every little piece had to be custom. But it was like when you wanted to change one little thing, that was just what you were supposed to do. So as homebrewing became more acceptable, as the idea of expanding your game became more acceptable, it was just really hard for me to accept that was now the term, because it was more like now it's almost like people are accepting, oh yeah, homebrew is normal for D&D, but it's like but for me it was like almost like it's always been normal to do this, and it's not homebrewing, it's called playing D&D. It's called playing exactly. The game by expanding what there is. So it was like, I don't want to say it was an insult, you know what I mean, but I came from a world where it was like homebrew was considered not gaming, not real D&D, and then suddenly it was like, well, homebrewing is okay, and it's like, it's always been okay, and it's not homebrewing, it's just the game. And again, that's a personal like spite that I had. It's just a personal like a stubbornness, because giving this aspect of the game a new name and giving it a thing, and now again, nowadays it's just intertwined with homebrew just means created not from a book, which is fine. It's and I'm okay understanding that is just what the colloquial term now is. It's just hard when coming from the mindset of that's just how the game has always been. And yes, we always needed a name for it. Like, I knew one day it would be better to understand, are we playing from the book or are we playing from like your realm? And there always needed to be a public word for that. I just didn't want it to be homebrew because it's just a stubbornness of back in the day. It was like, no, you guys didn't like homebrew, and now suddenly it's all the craze, and I'm like, I don't like it. So that's just me. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just.
Cosmic made a good point. He's like, it's canon lore versus non-canon lore, and like, to me, I'm very curious. I was actually just typing this in chat, but like, I'm very curious where that term canon came from.
Google it, man.
Like, I'm totally gonna look that up later.
But yeah, so I just wanted to give that for anybody that's new, that it's just like homebrew. I have a rickety past with it, but I still respect it now for its current term, which is basically just non-canon or non-Wizards of the Coast, material. And the way that I look at it is, now even more so, I feel like there should be a distinction between my original idea and what homebrew has become, right? Mm-hmm. I still think there needs to be a distinction, because homebrew can basically be anything, that was you created, from anything from a class, a weapon, all of that. But situations like this, now, if you wanted to say that you were creating a spell that did this, or if you wanted to say that you were creating a cleric spell that you could pray for and actually have repeated, we could call that a homebrew spell. But situations like this, where you're using your creativity and your roleplay and your dice rolls and working with your DM on the narrative that is the game,
that is this moment in time, this situation,
that to me will, like, at its core, that is the game. Like, to me, regardless of like, homebrew is whether or not you're adding things that aren't in a book. But that right there, what you're talking about, to me, there is nothing in the book unless, again, the DM's like, no, you can only do what's written. Like, you can only do spells that are written. But again, if your DM is open at all to those roleplay aspects, like being able to pray to your god and make a argument to your god, right? Like basically make a plea to your god and win them over simply by the words you say and maybe a dice roll. If your DM's more in line with that, what you're doing, I don't think would be called homebrew. That is just interacting with the world, right? Like, a module may say that you're near a stream of fresh water, but it doesn't say anything more than that. But you can go pick up the water, you can fill your flask with it, you can drink from it, you can swim in it, you can clean yourself in it.
You can bless it and turn it into holy water.
So all of these things can be done, but the book just said it's a stream of fresh water. You infer that all of these things can be done. And that idea right there of, if you have a god and your DM doesn't have hard set rules of you can only interact with gods via clerical spells, if there's any sort of wiggle room, then what you're doing is basically what they gave you in the setting to interact with. It's like saying that there's a spoon on the table and
what do you want to do with it?
Yeah, can I pick it up? Well, you can. You don't need to, but you can. That's to me where I still think there needs to be a separation between what's homebrew and what's not, because that, to me, if you're trying to make something that is repeatable, like replicable, like over and over, that, and then put it into a category like a spell, we call that that would basically be homebrew. But if it's like a one-time thing where you're just trying to accomplish something, being really, really creative, that is just like, again, I won't get over it. That is just plain D&D.
So I look at it like this.
At least me again. That's how I think D&D is.
Say I want to do a backflip. I don't have any skills that say this is the button you press to do a backflip, but I want to try. So they make me roll an athletics check to see if I can do it, right? It's the same thing here, right? You're just trying to do a backflip, i.e., talk to your god.
And get him to intervene.
That's just your way of trying to interact with the world that exists around you.
Yeah.
You're trying to see what happens. You're just trying to play the game in a way that
was presented to you by the DM.
Very much so.
So that's why I wouldn't call it homebrew.
Yeah, very much so. And I very agree with that assessment.
Unless you want this to be a thing. Unless you're literally trying to create a thing that exists that can be redone by you or multiple people. I don't, it's like saying that if I want to go like clean myself off in this stream, is that now a thing? It's like, no, it's just a thing you can do.
Real quick question then, along those same lines, the item that your first character always tries to go and create in whatever world that character is in, would you consider that homebrew? It's technically repeatable.
No, and the reason why is because A, it has no name. I know that's semantical,
For sure.
but A, it has no name. And B, every single one's created based off of my discussion with that DM and how their world works. So it's not so much that I say, I want a bandolier that has this many, here's the locations, here's what it's made. It's not like an item that I say, this is what I want.
Right.
I talk to them and say, hey, can I talk to a leathersmith? Cool. Can they basically make me more the custom item as long as I pay them? Cool. Can they know how to make buckles and straps? Cool. So talking with them, how many daggers, without anything else, just in general, how much dagger weight can I carry? And that's where the conversation goes. Because then to me, it's if they were like, I would realistically like dagger weight before it hurts your movement, I'll give you 6 daggers. Because, they're like 2 pounds each. So eventually it gets heavy. Well, if I only have 6, that depends on where I want to put them. They might all be on my belt. They might just be on my back. Whereas if someone's like, as long as they don't care about encumbrance, as long as you can justify where they are, that's the one where I'm putting fucking daggers literally everywhere. But the item that I make is always custom to whether it has to be fit to my armor, whether it has to be a body strap that goes over my clothes, or whether it's its own set of armor. So I don't consider that a homebrew item because that is a task that I set myself to interact with the world to set me up for what I can expect. Because when I'm brand new and I create this rogue, I'm level 1 and I only have 1, maybe 2 daggers. But once I get a little bit of gold, what I want to do is go into town and be like, hey, I can shop. We all know how shopping works. You get tables, you get, items and gold. But this is where I get to test the DM, right? I want to make something custom. Can I find a leathersmith? Can I find the person that does this? And I just push it. I just see how many I can essentially craft and justify. But because it's not a singular item that I always get the exact same way, I wouldn't necessarily call that a homebrew because I don't ask for the same item. And that's it's the same intent.
Right. And it's not like and it's not like you're just going and say, hey, I want a saddle or something like that, or hey, I want this one thing. I like that. And it is something that you intentionally and specific do. And just like we were talking about with Cosmic, he is going and actually interacting with the world that's been presented to him, and that's what you do. You go out and you seek these different ways to interact with the world.
Yes, I do it, but it's only when I do rogues, so it's not every single time. Mm-hmm. And it's only ever one time. It's only if I do a rogue for my first character or my first rogue in their world. But it's also not an item that's designed to be reused by anybody else. Like, I don't try to resell it or get the person. I basically, again, that's why I talk through it, because the idea is I just went in there, talked to the leather guy, said, hey, what if I added this? Hey, what if I added this? At that point, it's up to the DM if they want to be like, he now sells a dagger strap thing. That's whatever. Because I'm not trying to create a specific one. I'm just trying to work with the DM to see.
And at that point, it would become his homebrew.
Exactly. Because if he wanted to say, hey, there is now a dagger bandolier that you can buy. Hey, man, you just homebrewed off of my idea. That's cool. That's chill, man. That's exactly what I didn't do it to create an item. I did it to see what I could do in your world and what you would let me get away with. And again, I do it for a lot of different classes. I have different approaches to that. It's like when we first gamed in, you were there on the first time we did Lucifer's, like a long time ago, right? I think you were there for when he ran a game.
Oh, are you talking about?
This was a couple years ago. It was just like the first game that he ran. A bunch of people were there, but I just remember one of the first things I tried to do in that one, right? Because he didn't let me set up the dagger kit. Mm-hmm. For him, at the time, it was more of just what was available in shops. Mm-hmm. So that was a situation where I didn't get it. But I wanted to do other things. So another example, we were in combat and we had come into this area where there were there were 2 or 3 fire pits, mm-hmm. and with enemies around each one. But there was darkness in between all of them. So I remember I was just like, okay, so if I use my dash, if I can sneak up on them, and right before I get into the light, I'll use my dash. Basically, I was like, can I just dash straight next to the fire, take my water skin, cut it open with my dagger, and douse the fire and put them in darkness? Again, I was like, can I do that? Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. I'm like, it was my turn. We just got there. It wasn't initiative yet. There was darkness. I'm like, so I can sneak up just to the edge of the light. And I'm like, okay. I just want to run up, grab my dagger and my water flask or my water skin, because mm-hmm. It's just leather, and just run up and just slash it and then just douse out their fire. Because giving us more right. darkness to work in. And he let me do it. He gave me, the checks to do it, and I was able to do it and put 2 enemies immediately in darkness, and they had disadvantage for that fight.
That's clean.
And it was a one-time thing. You know what I mean? It wasn't like a feat that I wanted to be able to do. It was just, but it was me testing, can I play your game outside of the rules you expect, right? Because you expect just combat. You expect me to just do that. But to run up, kind of surprise them, but then douse the fire and then be within combat range on my next turn, that was to me a lot more advantageous. But I wasn't know if he would let me do it, right? Douse a whole fire with a water skin. Mm-hmm. But I got the roll enough to where it was okay, it wasn't that big of a fire, and you were able to get right into the center. So there's embers. I didn't put it out.
Right.
But there's no more fire, so there's no more light. But just
that's kind of dope.
Little things like that, right? Those are the things that I try to do to see what they'll let you do. If I'm a mage, and I learn something, a small example like fireball. Can I turn the fireball into an arrow? It's a small little thing, but would you let me manipulate? Do I understand? Because what that tells me is, so I'm actually in control of the magic. It's just the mechanical effect that you care about, right? So if they don't care what it looks like, you have more fun with it, right? Because then you could do more things and you could be more creative with it. Because let's say eventually they let you form it and make it bigger, and then you're like, wait a minute, so can I make it a disc? Okay, I can make it a disc. And then I have this robe that makes me immune to fire, right? So I'm going to cast Fireball, jump on the disc, and fly into the enemies kamikaze style on top of my Fireball disc. And land there, you know what I mean? Like, but that would be something interesting and creative.
Right.
You know, if you could, but because that's what I mean by when DMs say like, oh yeah, you can make it look into an arrow. I'm like, oh, if I can make it look into an arrow, I can make it look into a disc. If I can make it look into a disc and I could be immune from fire, that means can I write it? Like step by step.
Right.
What can I do with this? If they don't let me write it, then that idea falls short. But if they're like, yeah, why not? It's a disc of fire and you're immune to fire. Fuck it, you could write it. Then you're like, fine, I can kamikaze right into the middle of enemies, explode them all out, and there I am, like right in the middle. Like,
right.
But again, these are just like little things that I like to do to see what DMs what's possible. Because for me, that's where I have the fun, right? I don't. If I go into a game with a pre-built character that's pre-built till level 20, you know what I mean? Like I know every step that's going to happen, and all I'm doing is going into encounters and just rolling dice. Like that's a video game to me. That's literally just a video game on tabletop.
Yeah.
I like the intrigue. I like the puzzles. I like the riddles. I like the thought puzzles and the discussions with NPCs.
I'm curious if there is a limit to doing that too much, because I find myself often like going to the DM and being like, hey, can I try something crazy? Hey, can I try something outside of the rule set? Hey, you see that thing over there? And I don't wanna put so much like work and pressure on the DM that he's gotta like sit here and calculate all these outlandish things that I want to do. But like, it is a large part of how I enjoy interacting with the game. And so I just, you know,
that's why I have, not in a way that I look down upon people, but that's why when it sucks sometimes that I do miss being a player, but I've been spoiled, especially with my original DM. So I have very high standards. So I have high standards for a DM when I'm a player, but not for other DMs, right? Like as a DM, I don't have standards for other DMs.
Right.
But as a player,
it's like if I'm gonna play in your realm,
I have some standards, and I don't mean that you're a bad DM if you don't meet those standards. It's just for me to have fun, me to be able to enjoy myself.
It's what you're looking for out of the game.
Yeah, you're going to like. I need a DM who is.
But I mean, think about people's
mastered.
different tastes in video games, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you know, somebody who likes GTA might not necessarily like what's that? Fruit Ninja, right? You know, somebody who likes the what's that one game that's Fallout? This weird game where you just build little.
Oh yeah, Fallout Shelter.
Yes, Fallout Shelter. That game, they might not necessarily want to play Halo or whatever the case may be. I did try it; didn't work out.
Oh, I was like, I got a thing. Okay.
But yeah, like so, I forgot where I was even going with that, but.
Yeah, but when it comes to testing out other things, like I said, like I have high standards just because I have a high standard for what kind of game I want to play when I'm a player in D&D, and I feel like there's just a lot of rules can really ruin my gameplay, and I don't mean a lot of rules as in like rules as written, but a lot of boundaries to sticking to the plot make it difficult for me to enjoy the world.
Yeah.
Because it's not that I don't want to get to the plot and I don't mind time frames, but I don't want okay, so there's where you're going, but before that you're going to go to this tavern, and then you're going to go to that inn, and then you're going to go to that armor shop, and then you're going to go to that forest, and then you're going to have a certain encounter there, and then you're going to get to your goal. Like, to me, that's just like, okay, well then, like, anything in between them isn't
just turning the page in the storybook instead of actually
it's like if I know all of that,
a world.
Yeah, the idea is like, well, do you want to talk to anybody about where you're gonna go and what you like? You mean the forest that you said like that we have to go to? And again, I know that's just not the kind of gamer I am. Where when it comes to D&D, I don't have as much fun just accepting everything as is. You know what I mean? I don't get into the game like that. Like I don't mind one shots. I don't mind playing those kind of like board games, but I treat it more like a board game where I'm a little bit detached because I just, if it is going to be that short, if it's going to be a one-off, or if it's going to be a prefab where I have no real choices, like I just get handed a character, it's fun to play the game and to do the things, but I don't put much thought into it because I have no personal attachment.
Yeah.
And when I get personally attached, I want to like thrive in that environment. So it's like,
Very much
again,
so.
I don't want to necessarily go away from the storyline that DMs create, but the idea of structure, if it's too structured and too obvious, then it's like, well, why would I have a 3-hour conversation with this guy when I already have all the information I need, both as a player and a character?
Yeah.
I don't want the fluff just to waste time. And I know a lot of DMs put a lot of effort into that. And that's why it's like, if you put effort into making it matter, like if I don't know where I'm going, then it matters for me to ask the right questions. But there's a difference between I'm going to give you the information in this conversation versus you need to get the information out of this conversation. And that's the kind of DM I want. I want a DM that's not saying, hey, this is the conversation, you get the information. I want a DM that's, this is one of the conversations you could get it in.
I think a lot of the times it's hard because not everybody knows, like, okay, say you want to go explore in one direction, but it's like I don't have anything for that, you know, I don't have anywhere to go with that. But I don't know, I think like you said, there are different things that each person looks for, and I want to let my character lead my gameplay. And what I mean by that is, like, I want them to have a reason for whatever it is that they're doing. Like they're leading what it is. So if they're not gonna go down that road, like I can make up, like, it just feels like you're watching one of those movies and like they make a stupid choice, or they make a choice that feels very out of character for the person that they have been depicted to be thus far.
But it furthers the plot.
Exactly, but it takes the plot in whatever direction that it needs to go. It's just you're doing whatever you got to do. It doesn't fit. It doesn't flow. It breaks a lot of the immersion. Like whenever you're watching a movie, reading a book, or you're actually into some sort of piece of cinema, you're usually into it because you feel like you're a part of it. You feel connected to it somehow. And if that's what I'm getting to, even in video games, like I was playing Genshin Impact. That was one of the greatest reasons why. Like I felt like I got to explore this crazy, expansive world and be a part of it and go explore things and talk to people. Like, it was a lot of fun. But like, you get to do that in a world like it's so expansive with D&D, like, and then it just feels like you're just along for the ride. You don't actually get to be.
Or when you have those worlds where there's so much backstory and lore and so much written things that you can either read about or talk to people about, but none of that dictates, alters, or affects your gameplay or your actual plot line, right? It's kind of like the video games where it's like, hey, it's a pretty linear video game, but you know how much lore we have in books? You could find books everywhere and learn so much. And it's like, you could or you couldn't, and the gameplay is the exact same. That's the difference. I know some people that they live for that shit, and that's great. That's why I developed High Point to have such a rich backstory to discover and to talk to people about. And to have opportunities like Dobbs is in, to talk to certain NPCs to gather information as much as they want. But at the same time, I'm not that kind of player. I don't just want to have that, like, I don't like the idea of discovering the knowledge. I like that to affect how my player or how my character thinks and feels and acts. And the idea of that idea of having all of this rich backstory and having all of this lore about, the kings and queens and the rulers and all of this stuff. But it's like, but at the end of the day, I'm not involved in any of that. so I can know all about it and hear all about it, and that's fine. That's a cool story. But when I'm playing the game, all of that is wasted effort because it has nothing to do with what my character's doing. He can know all of that stuff, but he still has to go talk to that mercenary to get this item because of this guy. Like, who do I care whose boss's boss is deciding this and what war it's affecting? Because especially if you don't have the option to not do it, right? If you find out through all the lore you're actually helping the bad guy, like, does that matter though in terms of like, did I ever have a choice, or was it, that's the whole point? It's the big reveal of, aha, the thing that you didn't have a choice to do was the wrong thing to do. Haha. And it's like, oh darn, plot twist. The choice we didn't have a choice to make was the wrong choice that we couldn't make anyway. You know, for me, that's just not. It's cool. I like the story. I like the plot twist. I like hearing about it. It's definitely good for entertainment from like a a podcast, or when the celebrities do it. But when I play it, I'm just kind of like, yay, okay, we were the bad guys all along. That's cool. Like, it's surprising. It could be surprising, but it's like, if I didn't have a choice, like if I didn't have anything invested, right? If you made me believe and act and make my character make choices that were supposed to be the good choices, and then all along you revealed that you slipped in how they were supposed to be the good choices, but then when we look, like, I want to find out later down the road
that they were hints all along that you could have discovered, but...
like you could have, or you were given A and B choices, and A always looked like the right choice, but then when they tell you and you look back and you go, you son of a bitch, because when you said this, you actually, and then you start to picture that's the stuff that is the plot twist I care about, because when you make me feel like I had a chance and I still fell for it, that's what I want as a player. Don't make me the plot twist when there was absolutely no, like, saying that you were evil all along. It's like, okay, I had no choice otherwise.
I'm not gonna lie. That's kind of what I struggle with, is because every time I give them the choice, or if every time I like try to drop hints, or like, oh, you could have, they usually figure it out, and I'm like, I gotta be more subtle with it. So I gotta.
Believe me, dude, it's taken me years. I mean, like, I feel like I've gotten it down a couple times. Like, I'm not perfect, but there's been a couple times in several of the gaming sessions that I feel like I've slipped in the right things, or many sessions later, we've had discussions, and then I've gone back to the details and be like, remember when I said this and did this? And then it was like, there were moments where like, oh, and I'm like, that's great as a DM when you have to, like, when you go back and explain things and show them the reality, not just the, oh yeah, remember that shadowy guy that you chose not to talk to? Yeah, like, not that big, but when you're just like, yeah, remember when I said this, and remember when you did this? And then everyone goes, wait a minute. It's like, yeah, like, I like
random roll I made you make and didn't tell you what it was for.
As long as, I love putting the pieces together and making people realize that things were bigger than they realized at the time. And it's such a great aspect when they catch on. You know what I mean? Not when you just tell them, oh, by the way, this wasn't what you thought it was. But when you show them, you see what you missed, and then they go, fuck, we did miss it. Like, especially if they've almost caught on. And then you're like, wait a minute. So when I was thinking this, be like, yep, you almost had it. Like, it's just so great when they almost catch on to something, and then you've like got them back off the track. Yes. But again, that's what I enjoy. I was very spoiled. My DM was absolutely phenomenal with this, like, in ways that I don't think I'll ever be able to emulate. You know what I mean? Like, still like the way that he in-game pre-thought, or like for his gaming sessions, the way that he was able to not only think ahead, but very rapidly use like other gaming sessions to dynamically influence, like, I still remember like one of, like, early on when we first started gaming together, one of the first things that got me hooked during our gaming sessions was a way that he used the way that time works in game to can just completely fuck with my head as a player. Because one day we had a gaming session, and my character was doing some stuff with a group of people outside of his house. And there was a moment where I'm talking to an NPC, and as we're blah 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 talking, the NPC goes, "Oh, hang on a second," and he does. My DM always like acted these things out, but I always remember this because the NPC was like, "Oh, hang on a second," and my DM looks away, and he looks away, and then looks back, and then we just keep on talking. That was it. Just he was like, he tells you to hold on, he looks away, he looks back, and then he keeps on talking. That was it. Just it was I think a Wednesday or a Thursday, right? We're just gaming. That just happened mid conversation. I think nothing of it. We continue gaming. That Saturday we start gaming. Like a couple days later, we play another game. I game the same character, and I hadn't decided anything yet. There was this thing that I had for a while that I hadn't been messing with, and so that Saturday we had talked about doing some things about what I was going to do with my character that day, and I came when we got together. I was like, I had changed my mind and I wanted to mess with this other thing. This other thing happened to be something that would allow me to manipulate time for a short bit. So I'm doing different things, and my choices, he's telling me what my choices are leading me to. And I end up, by my own volition, mind you, not by accident, not by a role that he had control of, I, by my choices, ended up going back in time in front of my house to see myself and all those other people I was with, right? But time was frozen. I was just able to move throughout time, but time was frozen except for me. So I'm just basically looking at like a snapshot of the past. And as I'm looking around, I'm trying to figure something out, and I'm having some trouble. Like, I'm actually like, as a player, I'm just like, I can't figure out what to do next. And then I see the NPC that my past self is talking to, without moving, but also moving, lean over and start talking to me. And then he goes back and then freezes back in time. But several days ago, that's exactly what the NPC had fucking done. Mid-conversation, he said, hang on a second, looked away, looked back. So that was like, that's what got me hooked. That shit, when I realized what my DM had done, it blew my head, because I'm like, wait a second. You threw that in that gaming session on the fucking off chance that someday I might come full circle and do that, because he knew I had the item that could travel time. Never had a reason I would come back to this moment, but things were happening, and he knew I had enough interest in things I was with a group of people, but I was like, I didn't know what everyone was doing. And he knew I liked to know that information. So all I can imagine is he's like, once you learn how to travel time, you're probably going to snoop on shit. And this is a moment you might snoop on. So several days ahead of schedule, he put it in his game to give himself a reason to give me either a hint or to interact with me here. And again, all of my own choices led to that. He didn't know that's what we were going to be doing that day, but he knew it was a potential at some point.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's having that level of
that's
DM.
top tier DM.
And so that's like, you gotta realize, like, that's my inspiration of DMing. When I look at the complexity of High Point, that's the DMing that inspired me and educated me on, D&D. And just, the more complicated finer points of crafting your own story. Because I'm not saying that this is the expectation, right? I'm not saying that what he does is D&D at its core, but that is the type of D&D I like. The take what is the foundation and make it your own, and make something that is that vast. And that's what I want to emulate, right? I don't want to create those specific situations. Right. I'm not going to reuse that moment. But I use that moment. I remember that just so much, and it just inspires me to be creative and think ahead. And that's where, like, the prophecy, like the whole concept of the prophecy, and the way, like, you've seen how I've diced it up between the small bits and how they fit to the larger bits. It's that kind of stuff. Trying to look at how can different players interact with this, and what type of responses each of them should get. So I don't know. It's what drives me. It was those kind of moments that really drive me even to this day to be a better DM.
And what's very interesting is, even though technically none of this has been our topic, I still think that like what we've been talking about in this last chunk of time ties very well into our topic, because all this stuff that's going on throughout time and perpetuating throughout the universe, how he enabled himself to create continuity throughout his world by giving himself that opportunity.
Yeah, a little bit.
He didn't have to retcon, oh, in this conversation,
You remember
something
him,
happened.
or he didn't even have to. Because it's just a frozen bit of time, that he never had to even mention that like, again, he never even had to put it in there. But the fact that he did just inspires me to think ahead and not just do the DM thing of, oh, it's just because I said he can do this. He actually put it in there so there wasn't a question, right? It's the explanations behind everything that happens.
And again, that goes right into, we have those same explanations behind our homebrews.
Right.
Behind the things that we create and we put in the world. It's not just there because we said so, but there is a reason. And because there's a reason, when you go back in time, if it's something that would have existed back in time, there's still a reason, and there's an effect that it has on everything else, and it's one you can interact with and see and touch and all this, that.
So speaking of like the main topic for today, which is, the behind the scenes creating of homebrew, and Kage's right, talking about those continuity influences are also going to go into this topic as well. So talking about the idea that I had today, so I'll go basically walking through where the idea came from, how I transitioned it into High Point, and then I want to walk through the thought process that I regularly walk through when new things come about that I want to add. Because what ended up happening was I saw something today, came up with an item for my realm, but realized that it wasn't a new item. It wasn't going to be created now in present day. It was going to have existed. So I want to walk through the thought process of what does that mean, and how I go through mitigating what's the best way to implement it, right? So it started essentially with cruising Instagram while I was I was on a break from the YouTube channel. I did a bunch of the work on the YouTube channel today. I was taking a break, and I saw this really interesting one where basically it was a self-propelled wakeboard. So if you think of the old skateboards, the original like electric skateboards that had the controller arm in the front, it was basically like that, but built into a wakeboard. So it had this controller arm in front, and it was a wakeboard that basically acted like a jet ski, but without the handlebars. And it was just a fucking cool. It was a cool thing. And then because they were just kind of going along the water and they were holding the controller out, with on this like arm, my mind immediately went to not quite a jet ski, but like imagine almost like a canoe, but very small enough for one person to stand up in. And instead of like, the parts that come out to the thing, what if the first one came in and curved, was hollow? And then I started thinking, I was like, okay, well, using magic, you could shove air through there. And if you made the bottom have, inlet holes, that air would create a suction. It would actually basically working just like a jet ski, but using a more slimmed down version of the device.
Because you wouldn't need all the engines and all that.
Right, and you wouldn't need the whole arm to move and everything. Yeah. So the idea is you just need this piece coming up, like almost like a molded bent piece of bamboo. And, right. And then that's just affixed into a very small like canoe-like raft that has some outlets. So I came up with this idea and I was like, great. I actually really like this idea. It's basically a magical powered jet ski / this like wakeboard thing. But I was like, okay, let's think about this, because it's not just going to be brand new. Obviously, I was like, okay, so now I have to think, how and where does this best fit to have been invented? Because when I think of ideas like this, it took me a while to think of it, but it's also, I don't look at it from the point of view, well, because it took me this long to think of it, it took High Point this long to think of it. It's more of a, right. I look at it first and foremost, what's the justification and what's the likelihood someone somewhere in High Point would have created this? Because that right there shoves a lot out, right? You can just get rid of 98% of your setting by just asking who had, like, all the deserts, all the jungles, all the anywhere there's not water, fucking gone. Where, you know what I mean? Like you weed out what's the least likely areas, places, people to have invented it. And then what you're left with is that, but I also have the stretch of time as well. When are the likelihood of it to be invented, right? Because there's certain points of High Point's history that go so far back it wouldn't have been invented. And obviously I want it to exist now, so it's not going to be a future thing. So the next aspect is once I kind of nail down where it could be and when it could have been, then it's a positioning of, well, if I want to add something new to High Point, I have a lot pre-written into High Point. There's a lot of things that have already happened. There's a lot of what I've talked about, like fixed and flux points of time. And you can't adjust those fixed points. So one of the biggest questions that I have to ask myself is, now that I know where it could have been created, when it could have been created, I have to think about the impact on High Point's history. Because it may have been able to be created by such and such at some point in a certain time. But let's say I let that person be the inventor at that such and such time. If I look at the history of High Point and go, well, whoa, that would have changed their entire history had they invented it. It doesn't make much sense for me to do that. That's way too much work. And High Point works just fine without it. But adding it to that person's history to that point in time would drastically maybe change too many fixed points. Now, if they're all in flux, they're still in flux. I could still maybe adjust some things. But that's a lot more work. Whereas if I could find a better justification to a place where it won't negatively affect what I already have in place, but more than be fine justifying the existence of this item, right? So I created this thing, the alterations I made to it where I wanted to make series of it too, right? Because once you think, okay, it's going to be in High Point for a while, but there's going to be iterations of it. So that also helps me nail down who's going to have it. Because once I think of, well, let's say it wants to be in High Point for a while, but maybe it would, in its current mode, affect too many things. So it's like, okay, well, what's an earlier version of it? Because an earlier prototype or an earlier version that inspired this idea maybe fits and won't change a bunch of things, right?
Right.
So you think of this idea of having people have basically what are essentially jet skis. If I let that happen too far into the past, certain wars would be drastically changed by armies with jet skis, right? So how do you make them coincide? Well, if the current model doesn't fit, but I want them to have existed long enough to fit the current model, what if that time frame didn't have the current model, but it had a prior generation? Something that wasn't as powerful, wouldn't have changed the tide of the war, but I could still say was in the war, and it doesn't drastically change anything. So I went back to, well, where would have like the very first version of this would have been? And I figure the first version of this would have been on a giant sailing ship, not a small ship, or a multi-person canoe, but it would have been a larger item, because you look back at the history of sailing, like most people would have been physically able to do things, but the idea of using wind to move yourself probably wouldn't have come much up outside of swimming, physically swimming, because you can, like if you had the ability to like push air, you might be able to push yourself through water, but most likely it didn't really come up until the era of sailing. So whoever created it, once they begin their sailing era, if they can control wind, you can control your sails. If you can control your sails, you master the seas.
Right. So
I was like, well, let's say that's a pretty common idea in D&D, actually, using the spell Gust of Wind to lift, to gust out your sails. Having druids on sailing ships is a common idea in D&D because they could, use the same techniques to move wind. So I was like, okay, so obviously this has to be a wind background person. And they have to be not isolated, but not as common in all of the major fixed points in time that this may have altered, right?
Right.
But I also wanted them to be able to fit whoever can fit this model of how would it make sense that they got to this, this point. So as I was thinking about it, obviously Dov's character came up being an earthbender and having that new class that we've created, and we've created the other bending classes as, just development. So I felt that the best place that this would be, because it wouldn't make much sense for druids to have invented these, you know what I mean? Like, not to the extent of having it as an actual thing. Like, maybe one or two druids could have come up with the idea, but this wouldn't have been an actual thing for, coming from druids. And anything that lives in the water doesn't need a mode of transportation above the water. So looking at it from the view of how I have the all of the benders and the history of of them in High Point, I thought the airbenders would be the best to have been the inventors of this.
Right.
And looking at that, because in High Point, all of the benders were at one point intermingled, completely neutral to each other. They were basically an isolated group of people who eventually came together because they all had innate powers of the elements. Eventually they wanted to separate themselves from the other magic users during the Great Wars, especially the Great War of Magic. That's when they kind of isolated themselves because they thought themselves more pure, kind of like sorcerers versus mages. I just have magic, so my magic is more pure.
This would be after the Third Great War.
Well, so they isolated themselves during the Third Great War because it was the War of Magic.
And that's mostly when they were unified.
That's mostly when they were unified because they were like, hey, you know what? Fuck your bullshit gods. They don't fuck with our magic. They want to fuck with your magic. And fuck you for trying to fuck with our magic because you guys want to hoard magic and our magic's sacred. Like, it was a whole thing because that magic works differently, right? It's not spells and stuff. It's more like, how I have druids and how I have sorcerers. It's an innate understanding and innate communication with nature. So that's when they wanted to isolate themselves. And of course, over time, isolating themselves divided them, and that's where you have the Four Nations now. Right. And that's where we stand in current High Point era is the Four Nations, where you have more of several nations living adjacently, but not together. But during those transition periods, obviously, first they were overlapping, and they had no problem in each other's areas, but as things become worse, they started to make those little borders, and you had different ways to get over those borders. So one of the ways for air and water to traverse would be air would eventually have to learn how to sail. Like, you could have some of them learn how to be underwater, but the most effective way to travel across water for an airbender wouldn't be underwater, because you have to use your power for your breathing, use your power for propulsion. It would be over water. So you start with sailing. You start with being able to control the wind on the sails, which is great because at that point, no matter what your wind, what your weather conditions are, you master whichever you want to do. So you are way easier on the water. But then, of course, as times get worse, the waterbenders, they don't like you on their water, so they make the waves harder. So just because you can control the wind doesn't mean you control the waves, which means you'll need a smaller ship because they won't do like necessarily
capsizing
huge
and all this extra stuff.
Right. So you have to use different things, different opportunities, and different land masses. So you don't always need huge ships. So then you get into smaller ships, same thing. But then eventually you get to someone eventually would have to have come up with the idea that there is a way to, there's obviously a way to push, the sail, but has anybody been able to push, like, again, can a airbender at some point have been swimming and use air to push behind them to swim faster? If that idea is common enough, someone thinks of the idea of, well, how can I push the water in a boat? You come through enough iterations where eventually you have a sailing ship where you basically had like a strip in the front of the ship that went in and down and under, and you had a couple airbenders at front just shoving as much air as they could focus, and it would generate a little bit of thrust. Then you learn adding water into it, so the air is actually pushing water out and makes more thrust. Then eventually you get better into isolated tubes to where one bender per tube makes it more focused. You can fan it out, make it more controllable. Especially with the rudder, because then you can have it come out right underneath the rudder. The rudder still moves, and then I guess you just get smaller and smaller vehicles until eventually you have the personal sized, one that I created, which is basically a small, tiny one-person raft, which has a one funnel, like one little tube that goes out front, and a small little rudder that you hold in the back. And then of course you think, okay, well, that would be the common one. And then you have like the more elite one, which essentially would be directly modeled off of the original idea that this came from, which is that wakeboard, which would be much more of a single person raft with not really like the canoe with the sides, more like a raft with just a single hollow tube that is the bamboo and no rudder. And that one would be more controlled, like the wakeboard.
Right.
And that would be used for...
Almost like you're surfing.
Yes. And so the idea is like that would be used more for like your covert ops, like your really high talented airbenders usually for like either military ops or just some kind of high class
That'd be crazy. Just see a
version.
SWAT team of these guys just like slowly.
Because that would be the
going over
idea. Is it's
waters.
tiny little vessels that they could quietly move across the water, but you need to be agile to move them. So not everyone would use those. Whereas the canoe one, without anything, it just floats. You can just sit there and stand on it and move around. Whereas those other ones, you have to be like, it's like a wakeboard. If you don't know how to perfectly stand, it's smaller than a surfboard. You're going to fall over.
Yeah.
And
So
the other
that's
one has the
something to stand
rudder.
on
So
still.
so just, unique idea, but it's like thinking about all those layers, right? I couldn't change a lot of High Point's history with this, but I also wanted to make it available enough to not just be isolated to someone who never interacts with anything else. But it really made sense that the Earthbenders would be the ones to create this through that exact process. And with thinking about that, that allowed me to make this historically brand new item historic, right? I just came up with this item. No joke, guys. I literally came up with this item like 6 hours ago. And now it exists in High Point. And it's not even, I'm not 100% done, but this is the thought process I've gone through today. I looked at how and where does it make sense to input it? How will it not change drastically anything? So by them having them, it doesn't make it impossible for them to appear elsewhere throughout High Point. But they won't have, by them creating it, it won't have made such an impact for me to have to retcon or change anything historically. Now
Right.
they can exist, and even now they can pop up in places that I didn't originally have them, but they won't be a significant change. They'll just be a background addition. You know what I mean? And that's kind of like, that's the things that we don't always talk about when it comes to homebrew, especially when you're a DM looking to add things to the realm. Is like, I talked about like adding, pop culture into your lore. But again, we don't talk about really the butterfly effect and the propagation through both where and when and how. It's like, it's all three of those that propagate through your setting. And trying to describe all of those isn't always easy, but
Yeah.
that's the process that I like to take is like, who has the least impact, who makes the most sense, and what's the progression, right? Because the item that you came up with doesn't necessarily have to be the only item, right? It could be the current version, and maybe there are future versions I'll create. But as of right now, if that's the current version, what came before it? How did we get here?
Right.
Because those might be easier to allow into the history books because I mean, think about all of the wars that we know of, right? Think about World War I and World War II. We know the general weapons that were used. We know what type of guns and what type of tanks and what type of planes were used in those wars. But then you see those documentaries of the super secret, like, like the super weapons.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the German like super tank that was like 3-4 stories tall, and it was a tank that was like the
crazy.
massive tank that they tried to make was insane. But you never think about that because it either didn't get created, or it failed, or there was only ever one and it wasn't as effective as they thought.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many super weapons that have been created or thought up in our world that just never changed the tide of a war, but were either actively used or just turned out not to be effective, or broke or whatever. But that's the idea of these things, right? Is the prototypes of this new, wannabe jet ski, right? I haven't named it yet. That's how new it is, guys. I don't even have a name for this thing yet. But the prototype doesn't have to change a war. It could have benefited someone in a fight, and I could just retcon that a couple of the ships had this. But just because they had it doesn't necessarily mean that they were going to win the war. But the prototype was tested in that war is what now I can say.
Yeah.
And that's now what led to this. So what I'm doing is I'm adding that historical justification, adding the reasoning. So if someone wants to discover this history, if they see this item in my world and go, I want to learn about this, these are the things that I'm now inputting to make that justification without doing the, well, I'm a DM, I'm just saying it can happen. I'm trying to look for where does it make sense. There are plenty of wars where ships carried, prototype guns that we never heard about because they either succeeded and became a different gun of a different name, or they just didn't work. And that's what this is. It was a item on a ship that maybe it was in the wrong battle and the other side controlled the waters better. So even though they had this item on their ship, there was no need to use it because they were already in close combat. So no one ever discovered, and that ship got sank, right? So no one discovers that that was an early prototype. It just, they never needed to go anywhere, so they never needed to use it. But now you have that lore, and it doesn't change anything about High Point. I don't have to worry about anything else about that, about what I've ever said about that war, because I'm not adding in anything substantial. Right. But yeah, and that's just one of my processes. I want to probably do a couple more of these examples over time when you know, we come up with these things. But that's just one of my examples of what I did today and how I went through and made sure that the impact on High Point wasn't going to be substantial. It wasn't going to be substantial to me, but it's not also going to change like my players. Like, it doesn't change anything about, you know, you don't feel like, oh, all of a sudden, like, now things don't make sense, and
right.
it won't make any difference to you because, A, you haven't seen it before anyway, and once you do see it, none of the lore that you know about High Point will be affected.
And even if it's like, because how often does a character be like, hey, would my character know this?
Right.
And then you go back and search your character's
mind.
Like
for Dobbed, you could be like, so you could ask me, like, if you were asking me like, hey, so now that this is created, Dobbed is from the Four Nations, right? Like, does Dobbed know about this item? Now, that's a great, like, that's could be a perfect question. Does Dobbed know about this item? It's not super common, like, you know, it's not like jet skis where everyone just has one, but there's a much more higher likelihood Dobbed would know about it. But does Dobbed knowing that this thing exists really change anything about what you've done in your history? It's not like you would own one. It's not like you could have brought it with you. It's not like you could have used it. You might have, maybe you've missed out on an opportunity to make a reference to it. Like, man, it'd be a lot easier if I had just had that item. You know, like when you went, when you got to where you are now, when you went to the center of the Crater Lake and then had to go underneath. Yes, now that you know about this item, maybe we had a missed opportunity for you to be like, you know, back in my town or back where I'm from, we had these things. Like, but does it really change? You wouldn't have had it. So that's where we could say, like, yeah, you probably know of devices like this, and maybe there's even a sketch in your dad's notebook. But we've never talked about your dad's notebook every single page. You don't know Dov knows every single page.
It's all stuff that you go through and research, and even though the character has been through the notebook back and forth and knows,
but it's not relevant, right?
It's when it comes up. Like I said, not every memory in Dov's head is always relevant, but sometimes when the time comes, like if we're in a situation and, you know, somebody's asking about how one of these things work, and I, as the player, go to answer, but I'll be like, oh, wait, does my character actually know?
Yeah, it's like, oh, Dob doesn't know how they work. He just knows that they work.
And so, like, maybe he does know. Maybe there's a chance that he met with a waterbender and, like, chatted with one of them, and they told him, oh, my gosh, my dad was fiddling with one of these things, and he had a conversation with it. But, like, regardless, like, that would come up in the moment.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to, like, go stage.
It doesn't hurt what you've ever done.
We just do it when it comes, you know, just like most of the other things, which is what I appreciate about a lot of this stuff. Is it's like you don't have to worry about every single piece every single time. Yeah, you can allow things to manifest organically, you know.
So what about you? So I want to kind of hear what your process is, how similar or how different it is to mine. But like, let's say you come up with this new thing that you want in your setting, but it's not something that is new. It's not something that's created in the moment. It's something that you want. You as the DM have just come up with it, but you want it to have existed. What are some of the things that you go about doing?
A lot of the times, because that is what ends up happening, is either myself or my players want something, right?
To have existed.
Cool or whatever. And so one of my players didn't want a lot of knowledge about their own backstory. Almost like, I don't got any memories. I don't know a lot about what's going on. And one of the elements of their character was that they had a magical sword, but a magical sword that they almost never use and never touch or never do anything with. And, you know, they don't want to know a lot about it, but they're just almost this mysterious character where they are almost discovering their character as it comes to life.
Right.
Which, you know, I'm here for it. But a lot of what I like to do is okay, so that's what you know about your character. Now it's my turn to fill in all that information and actually bring that stuff to life. So, this sword is not just a sword. Like this sword has power, right? And so now it's my job to decide where that power came from, how it occurred. So, and I like, because I have very similar mindset when it comes to time, when it comes to the elements of flux versus the elements of consistency, right? And so a lot of the times I like having, if you haven't investigated it, it might not exist yet. Now, that's not always the case. There's stuff that I've created that my players have never even looked at before, right? But sometimes, like, again, I look at my realm a lot like Minecraft. When you look out into the distance, it just kind of fades, right? And so that's kind of what you're seeing when it comes to the explored world. Everything behind you is concrete and it doesn't go away. But
so everything is kind of just a what if future, a constant what if.
Lightweight, like you don't know what's there until you investigate it. Now, once you touch something, it's going to ripple effect. All of the things, it's just going to render in that moment. Like it's there. Like like there's gonna be something concrete there, but it renders as you go to interact with it. And so a lot of the times, when somebody wants to create something like this, it makes the perfect piece of a puzzle that hasn't yet rendered yet. And now I'm rendering it now. So
right, you can finish the rest of it.
One of my former gaming groups had a situation where they were dealing with the body of an old deity, right? And so they had a severed one of its limbs. And a cult was using it for cultish, weird, creepy rituals, trying to summon
like
demons.
you do.
Like you do, right? They were doing their creepy stuff. And so they were using this godlike artifact to kind of basically power a lot of what they were doing. But nobody in that world actually investigated where this arm came from, what god it came from. Now, I knew what god it came from, and I knew that I knew how and why it got severed, but I never specifically articulated what it got severed with, or what happened to what it got severed with. And so, this enabled me to create a perfect lore. Like, this is the story of how that blade became the blade that it was, right? And I know how I'm going to take it after this character leaves it, right? But at the end of the day, like, I now have like an origin story, like being created for something. And I think that, especially when, and I know that, I don't know if it's on the record or off the record, but we've had a couple of conversations about music in your world and how sometimes you'll just find something and it just fits the pocket, right exactly where it's supposed to be, right where it needs to be. And it's really, really cool to be able to see something fall into place like that. So when I'm fortunate enough to find things like that, I love to just weave it in. But when it comes to some more spontaneous things, one of the biggest things that I like to do is find a reason for it, right? Because in any situation, especially when I have so much undiscovered country, so to speak, undiscovered lore in my realm, like, anytime there is a question that isn't answered, it's an opportunity for me to generate something that wasn't there. I think what's amazing about what you have built is you have set up a foundation for things to grow upon, right? But what I've done is, especially because my world needed generation, my world needed generation and it needed it quickly, right? And eventually one of these days I need to solidify things in my own headcanon before presenting it, but there is lore behind what I have created that I would like to bring into manifest, right? But a lot of what this is helps me to explain why things are the way that they are. And it's like I can bring a whole lot of different ideas and places to the table and mesh things together because I'm able to render them as needed. I'm able to bring things into fruition as needed. Like, one of my characters wanted to create a new religion. Now, in that particular situation, it wasn't something that was going to have been. They are the proprietors of that religion. That started here.
Right.
But at the same time, like, those things have ripple effects. Like, they're now seeing, what do you call it? Like, bigger, some of the campaigns that have happened since then are seeing, you know how you started off with like Christianity and then Catholicism and all that. Like, you're seeing the different branches of what it has turned into since its original inception. And so it's very interesting to see the development of how things have changed and evolved over times after you've created it or spawned it initially, and then on the vice versa, basically what you've been doing with this is basically the reverse of that, reverse engineering its origins from the time of inception when it was thought of to the time it actually would have been created. And so it's I don't know, I really enjoy the process of like finding and putting things together, especially because, you know, we're talking about all the twists and turns and all the you never know what's gonna happen type deal. Like, those types of aspects of the, like, we have seen that time and time again, and so now getting to put those things into practice, put those things into reality, manifest them in the realm that you've created. I don't know. I think it helps out a lot if you have the idea of the consistency that you're looking for.
Yeah, and I think knowing what your desired outcome matters the most.
Yeah,
you know, I know what influences me to be the DM that I want to be, and I know. I don't know. I couldn't tell you the exact image I have of High Point, like what is the ideal version of High Point, but I know the outcome that I want for myself and my players. I know what type of gameplay, I know what type of story and narration I want, and I know what kind of experience I want my players to be able to have. I know what type of interaction I want them to be able to have. So with that, those are the guidelines that help me decide. I mean, I find it like fun too, right? It's not like a chore. Like, I know some DMs like complain about things, but like when I created this, that was fun. When I created it and then I realized I had to make it fit, that was just something that my mind just went off of, and that was like a side thought while I was doing the YouTube stuff. I was just, you know, sitting there tinkering with the idea. And like you said, it's fun for me. Not everyone enjoys doing it. And if you're not one to enjoy doing it, but you feel the need or the desire to do that, start small. You know what I mean? You don't have to do it to the extent that we do. You know, I enjoy the idea of thinking about, I created this idea, but the idea that I had to go back and create prototypes and figure out how those fit in the progression, I now have a bunch of new things. And the best part about all of that is now that I've solidified all of that propagation, there's going to be at some point where I think back on, you know, like the ship, you know, the larger ships that had some sort of like aspect of this that also helped move them. And, you know, maybe you would say like the very, very first one was basically like a trolling motor version, to where you would sail near dock, bring your sails up, and instead of having a tugboat, you just used like these different ports at the front of the ship to just push water out the back, and you can steer yourself into port a little bit better. So maybe that's the very first reason they ever used it, was to just guide a large ship into port. But when I think about that, then you think about, well, wait, so they've learned about how to manipulate bamboo and make air tubes. So does that also mean they made like the pneumatic systems where they can send things around a ship? They could put like a little thing in a canister and just hit it with some air, and it goes to a different part of the ship. Like how banks have. So
right.
That's another item that, so the more I think about the propagation, not just of this item and its effect, all the things that I invent on top of it, those will now spawn ideas. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's like,
and I do love that.
So being able, for me, it's more fun because it's not just the single item and why and the how and the why and the when and the where, but it's now that I did all of that. Well, now that they created that, what other problems similar did they solve? Right, like that was one of the many problems that they solved. Or I might just start diving into, okay, so how did they exactly solve all these problems? Like I know the progression of how they got here, but let's talk about how did they win and how did they actually make it? Like what stages, what problems did they come across? How did they solve those problems? Can those problems come up with unique inventions for something completely unrelated?
Right.
But just simply the fact that they created it makes a huge difference. So those are kind of the things that I really enjoy doing. But if you're not a DM who's good at that or doesn't like doing all of that, start small. Just start with, if you want to add something but you want it to have history, first just get the item in the time and place that you want it as its current version, right? So you want to add a jet ski into your world. Figure out what you want to add for present day world, right? That's the jet ski. Once you get that done, unless you have the expectation that players are going to ask for history of things, you don't really need to worry about too much from there. But if you want a little bit of lore, figure out why does that, a good question is, why does that place have it? Because if it's a necessity versus an efficiency thing, then if it's a necessity, maybe they created it. If it's an efficiency, as in it just really made things better, maybe they got it from somewhere, right? So these are like the steps you can ask yourself if coming up with these like propagations are too challenging or you just don't enjoy them. Ask yourself, okay, what is the item and where do I want it as is? Okay, why do they have it there? Was it a necessity or did they just want it? If it's a necessity, maybe they're the creators of it. And if it's just a desire or it made sense, how did they get a hold of it?
Right.
And then that next step, why did they come up with it? So if they created it or if someone else created it, you still go one step. So they created it out of a necessity. What was that necessity? Okay, how long
are they solving?
Yeah, and then how long have they they have this item in this current state and you want them to be doing X well. So how long have they had it? How long have they had this item or, whatever. And then it's like, okay, so however long they've had it, if you want to keep going with it, you just ask yourself simple questions. Well, where were they before they had it? Because if that's a question you ask next, why? Because where were they before they had it? Not just like, obviously if it makes their production better or whatever, or it helps them do something. But if you know where they were before they had it and where they are after they had it, then you can even go one step further and go, okay, well, what was the first version like? Because they obviously didn't get this as is. So then you can start doing the progression, right? Is, well, if they were way back here in the Stone Age before they had it, and now they're in the Bronze Age after they have it, what was that transition like? How did they make the stone version of this before they found metal? Why, and then you can ask simpler questions depending upon how much you want to actually put behind it. Is it one or many? Is it common or rare? Like, and you don't even talk about the rarity type. You're just talking about, is this common as in everyone has one, or is there only one of a kind, or wherever in between? Also can tell you, what type of person made it. Was it a single person, or is it like a culture thing that can make these?
What do you think about, because I've run into situations where it's like, I have an idea for something cool, but I don't want it to be crazy common because it might be a little too aggressive, Again, I don't like the term game breaking because I don't necessarily think that that's possible, but I think that there are some
you want to be selective.
Yes. And so the question is when you're looking at these things you can create, like, what if I want to restrict who can make it? But think about a creation like this. If it's just made out of bamboo and bamboo isn't rare, like,
right.
what am I gonna do to make this thing harder to create, or like how do I?
This is where I put things like that's a very good question in terms of like when I made this thing. The reason why I chose the benders is because I know that they haven't interacted and don't have a ton of weight to be thrown around throughout the history of High Point, right? Like they weren't major players in most of the things. They've stayed.
I mean, okay. Out of curiosity, did they come into fruition when I desired to be Doved, or were they around before that?
I had plans, but it didn't come full circle until Doved.
So there was a seed, but it hadn't started growing yet.
Yeah.
Bet.
Like I had the seed and the idea that I did want to make these classes, like custom classes, but none of the ideas and even the concept of the four nations and their history hadn't been solidified until Doved.
Okay.
But like, so what I like to do in terms of restrictions, first of all, knowledge is power. Like restrict the knowledge, and that's the first thing. So you may see someone on a wooden object flying across the surface of the water.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? What does that mean to you? Like, first thing is knowledge. Just because you see something, you don't have to describe what it is. Like, right? And then even if they see what it's made out of, it's like, it looks like a wooden floating, like boat, a very tiny boat with a rudder and a, bamboo tube sticking out. Just because you have that knowledge, a real life player could jump to the conclusion of exactly how it's built. But now you have to put in the obstacles of, okay, how are you going to build it? What materials are you going to use? How are you going to put them together? Whose knowledge are you using? Are you going to pay someone to do it? How are you going to stop them from selling the idea once they've understand what you're doing? You start to put real life concepts. Like, just because you see a microwave doesn't mean you can go make a microwave, right? Mm-hmm. You know all the parts. You can look on Google. Doesn't mean you can make one. Like, doesn't mean you can just start manufacturing them, right? So I like the idea that the first step in restricting things is knowledge is power. Second thing from there is you start escalating command in terms of if you are based in a town, if your setting's based in a town and people want to, do something, have restrictions in the town. Like, have a permit for making magical items. So no one can make magical. It's illegal to make magical items without a permit because it's too dangerous. Boom. It's a if they already know how, if they've broken the knowledge is power rule, put a hierarchy. The town says you can't do it. It's a type of magic that you have to learn from a certain wizard, and he doesn't like to tell anybody. It's protected by gods. Only God, the gods are withholding that type of magic, or they're withholding the knowledge, or so for instance, one thing that I really liked that I almost took this from my DM, but I decided to do it a different way, because of the way that I introduce magic and the way that magic flows in my world, and with music the way that it does. I decided that the way that he had it isn't ideal for me, but I loved the idea, and I almost took it. But one of his gods, I don't know if it's the actual god of music he had, but it was one of the gods that was associated with music. But the way that like I use music for certain people, situations, and things is more organic in the way that it's used, in terms of the way that it's created. Whereas in the old realm, you could basically like essentially petition for a song. So if the player had a song they wanted to dedicate or use for their player, they basically had to work with the DM to make sure it wasn't already taken by another, NPC or whatever. But if it was, you don't just get it. There was actually in-game things you had to do. If like to actually earn it in game. So you actually had to either I think one of the options, you had to be able to play it. So you had to learn an instrument in game with the proficiencies and be able to play the song. Or find someone who could, like a magical being who could help generate the song. But then once you did it, you also had to basically petition that god to have him grant you that song. And it would grant you not only the authority, and basically you'd be on like the official, like, you know, a celestial ledger, so no one could take that song. But it was also the explanation of how it granted you your power, like how you could use it, like your song actually like manifested stuff. That was where I got the idea of like songs actually like did things. It wasn't just like the idea, but it was actually like if you played the song or if the song played, it could actually like give boosts and stuff. And so yeah, so his was so in order to get a song, you had to petition the god. Like you could go up to that level. I don't do that because I like the idea of things being able to happen naturally. Because the way that music is ingrained with magic, they're kind of like their own mantles. You know what I mean? Situations can cause magic to react, and that reaction can be a song, and that song now exists to represent that moment in time. And it's not really a specific god. Like the god of music does catalog all of those, but he's not in control of them. It's more like the god of music just has the catalog of what's been created, but he has no rights of authority to change it himself. But he also has influence on what can be added. So there's a little bit of that, but it's not so much a you go and get petitioned, but he can help influence the magics of music in order to maybe give you favor in order to obtain a song. But that's more of a divine intervention. It's more of a offering. It's not so much a you have to go do that. People can get songs in multiple ways, and it's not as difficult, but it's also not just I want this song, so therefore I get it. Right. You have to basically do something or become a worthy enough character for like the universe to acknowledge you. So yeah, you know, no big deal. Okay. Just be acknowledged by the universe. Just be acknowledged by the universe. That's all, and you'll get a song. But I feel like that's a better justification than going and having to do all of this like role play and in-game stuff. Like you could find a way to get many gods. You could have like a couple gods, like, you know, get their attention, get their favor. And yeah, gods can help you craft a song. Like they can work with the magics of music to be in your favor. But for the most part, it's doing those incredibly heroic acts, or, you know, doing things that the universe itself like if you were involved in a fixed point in time, like essentially the reason you're there is the reason why it's fixed, like the wibbly wobbly reasons. That could be a reason why a song gets created. Or if for whatever reason a player, because it can technically happen, but let's say a player enters a flux point in time and causes it to become fixed. As in,
they fix a flux?
They fix a flux.
I didn't know you could fix a flux.
Well, the idea is the flux times are for multiple reasons why they can be in flux. But if a player interacts with it too much, there's no way I'm going to allow any retconning or any, like, there's a point of complexity to where you will make that to where, that's what will now always happen because you've touched it. Like, you've collapsed it into a fixed point in time. Now, not all fluxes will do that. Not every single time. Like, for instance, you know, I don't know. No, that was a bad example that I thought of. But yeah, but basically, yeah, it's not going to happen all the time. It's not like you go to a flux point in time and it automatically changes. But you can interact with them enough to basically to have influenced it enough to where it's now locked.
Right.
But yeah, so with that, I really like going back to your question in terms of how do you lock things. Start simple, you know, start simple with knowledge.
Right.
If they don't know how, lock it behind them having to figure out how. Then if that's too difficult, or if they're too smart, or if they're already advanced enough to know the how, lock it behind in-game authority. And you just level up the authority based on what you need, you know? If you want to make an item that's not like there's only one in existence, but it's hard to create or it's hard to make and there's not many of them, make it, you know, if you want to justify why are there only 50 of these in my entire realm, the item, like one of the natural items is extinct. Like there's a plant that you need, a root, and it's extinct. So now there are only 50. So you can't make any more. That's your lock. You used an in-game authority of the fact that there are no more ingredients. These were all made before then. Or the guy who knows how to make them made 5 and then he died. And there are 5 steps, so even if you res him, you can only ask him 3 of the steps. Like you know what I mean? Like there's some sort of in-game blockage that will stop you from solving the puzzle easily. And that's, of course, you never want to say, well, you can't just ever do it, but you give them enough, like reasons to where you have to try harder than just asking for the right knowledge. But that would be how I would do it. I would, depending on what they're asking for and depending on how you want to block it, just, start with knowledge. Then you just go, you start with knowledge and then you go into authority. And then you just increase the authority. And I mean authority as in not necessarily gatekeepers, right? You can mean authority as in people who won't let you have it, or authority as in what's the requirement? Like, is it an item you can no longer obtain? Is it knowledge that someone died with? Is it, locked away behind a culture that's been lost, or that they're in the Underdark, so you have to adventure to go get them, or there's so many. I say authority, but I just mean authority as in how is the information held, and is that information accessible, whether it's intentionally gatekept or fundamentally gatekept, because again, it's dead. So those are the ways that I would go about it. It's much better than just saying just because.
Yeah, very much so. Very much.
And it gives them, and even if you don't ever intend to let them have it, it constantly gives them something to game for. If you first say you don't know how, and then they go, well, I figured out how. But like, oh, well, the items no longer exist. Oh, well, I found a way to go back in time. I got the items. Well, the magic person who made it all, he's dead. And so you need his magic. Well, we found a way to res him. You know what I mean? Like you can keep putting blocks in front of them, but you never want to just say why would you ever do that? You can't, because then you're just basically like, but they had all of this adventure, all of this all this gameplay that they did, all of the things that they tried to do and accomplish this. Why tell them from the very get-go you can't?
I mean,
don't bother. I don't like to do that. I will give them every reason for their characters to know that it's impossible. But, and this is the difference, right? I don't mind the in-game characters being told
it's impossible. This
is a long dead ancient wizard that no one knew his name, on top of a mountain no one knows exists or where it exists, with a flower that went extinct. And all 3 of these things are the only times you can do it. And it needed a moon, like it needed a lunar eclipse that was a moon that got destroyed. You know what I mean? So it's like literally you could tell the characters, the person that made it, the item that created it, the place that created it, and one of the celestial, moons that created it are all gone. No one knows where they are. They're all gone. You can tell the character that no problem. And that basically tells the character it's impossible. But as a DM, I think it's wrong to tell the player, yeah, you can't do that. Even if you say because you can't find the play, because if you tell the player, hey, look, the guy's dead, so you can't do the magic, you can't find the ingredient, you can't find the location that's needed, and the moon's gone that it's needed, and you can't do it. Telling the player that is to me, that's fundamentally wrong, as the way I like to DM, because telling the player it's impossible by telling them these are all the clues, that's how normal life works. The player says, oh, okay, the moon's gone. We can't possibly recreate the moon. But the player going, so if I was able to travel time, though, I could get the moon back? That's what pushes gameplay, the agendas. I'm not saying that you have to make a plot point and you have to do the open world thing where they just go after that. But if the character knows something, but the player wants a way around it, and that's just their personal agenda to learn, let them have it. I don't see a reason why not to let them grow and expand, because even as human beings, we go after things that we have no idea if they're ever possible. And the things we learn along the way are way more important than the goal that we set out to accomplish. And that to me is one of the standards that I look at as setting myself apart from other DMs is I will let the characters in game have every reason to know and believe and be faced with the fact that it's impossible. But as a DM, I will never tell my players it's impossible. I will always let my players try. I will always let them... I won't lie to you. I won't be like, oh, yeah, guess what? The moon's gone. Wink, wink. It's impossible. Wink. I won't egg you on into false pretenses. But you know what I mean? Like, I won't like make it seem like it's possible when it's not. I just don't believe in making that hard barrier of don't even try. If I tell you, hey, guess what? Everything works against you, but if you want to try, like, it's not impossible. Like,
So,
you know what I mean? I
know
want that
there are some
reason to go
DMs
for
that
it.
are just like, hey, so as a DM, and maybe you want to go as far as calling it like a boundary. It's like, hey, I don't want to allow you guys to X, Y, and Z, or I don't want this to go down in this situation. And so where, all right, I don't want to just tell you no, but I'm going to say there are all these obstacles that's going to make it really highly unlikely. But then there's that player, it's like, listen, screw your obstacles. I want to do what I want to do.
Hey,
And so they
that's
go
great.
out and they go out and they do all that stuff. But the DM's position hasn't changed.
That's okay.
Like, it's the fact that
I still
don't-
think that's great. I think that's
don't
actually
wanna-
perfect.
I don't want to allow that. And
Then
so
don't allow it.
And so when they go through and they're like, every single challenge, like, I have gone through and I have overcome every single one of your hurdles. And for me, I wouldn't want to put my player, I wouldn't want to, and it's not that I wouldn't want to allow them, because I want to allow them to do whatever they want to do, but it's like, hey, you going down this road is going to take this game a place I don't want it to go. So,
And, you know, and that's totally
it's like-
fair for the DM to make that boundary if
And
it's
it's
going
just
to take
like-
the whole game. But if, you know, I would say, yeah, if you feel like the player is going to take the game in a different direction, I'm 100% with you that you might want to put a little boundary.
And it's not so much like the gameplay will be bad or whatever. It's like, even if you can do it in your own side time, so to speak, and just like while the rest of the game is progressing, you can, but what you would accomplish inevitably by overcoming all of my boundaries would inevitably take the game in a direction that I don't want it to go.
Right.
And so it's like, I want to do my best to just not encourage you to even try.
But that's also, you know, the question of you deciding how far can that path go. Because just because you say there's a bunch of obstacles and the character says, I don't care, I want to try, doesn't mean that you can't just outright fail them on the first obstacle. You know what I mean? Like, if you say, like, okay, the first thing is there's a flower that went extinct. Okay? Like, that's all they're going to get, right? It's a flower that went extinct. And they could be like, well, I'm going to go look at all the libraries. There's no books. It's literally lost to time. Like, that's, like, again, literally the only way you're going to do it is by going back in time, but then there's no name. Like, again, there's no, I don't think there's anything wrong with, if you don't want it to go that way, I don't think there's anything wrong with not letting the game go that way. I mean, there's a difference between railroading and just legitimately, like, not letting things go in a certain direction.
Railroad means you have to go this direction. Like, a wall just means there's nothing that direction for you to go.
And again,
So
that's not necessarily bad. I don't have those in my world just because that's the way I play. I play the open
100%.
world, but I don't think there's anything wrong with putting
I'm
up
the same way.
Yeah,
but
I
like,
don't think there's anything wrong with putting up invisible walls.
I've met DM those boundaries that you have in the video games.
Yeah.
It's like there's just nothing there.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with putting up invisible walls, especially if it's an area you don't want people to go to. Again, for me, I just think that the better route to take is to tell the character no, not the player. And I think that's what I was trying to say is you can tell, like you could literally tell the character in game time travel does not exist, and the only way to create that is under a full moon that was destroyed 1,000 years ago. I'm not telling the player you can't, but the character knows there's no way in hell.
Right.
The player can be like, I am making it a personal choice to figure out how to bring that back, and you're like, good luck, buddy. You can try all you want to bring that moon back. But guess what? You know what I mean? Like I don't mind the invisible wall like that if that's just not where you want to take it. I just have a hard time with the idea of just telling a player don't bother thinking about that, because I like to encourage my players to think outside the box, even if I know it's going to be fruitless. I mean, I'm not saying that players can do anything, right? Like there are plenty of things that they can't do, but I won't stop them. You know what I mean? I'm going to let them try, because the idea is, like, if I know, like, let's say there's a secret door and they're like, I'm going to try to pick this lock and open this door. And I know that this door from the other side was hit by like a dragon's fire weapon. And literally in the entire other side is one giant block of metal. The door can't be open. It's literally fused into the metal wall, right? But a character's like, but they don't know that. And I'm not going to tell them that metagame. But if a character's like, I'm going to do whatever I can to do this, I'm going to let them keep trying. I'm not going to be like, don't bother. I'm going to let them be creative until they can figure out why it's not opening. And if they can't, then what I would hope that I have done before then is prepped the character in every way possible to know it's not possible. As in, the last known record was that there was a great roar and what sounded like a giant explosion behind the door. And then they could have found descriptions that the door is only, decorated with wood, but is primarily metal. Like you could give them basically everything but the actual thing that happened behind the scenes. And if the player gets frustrated, be like, this is bullshit. It's a door. Why can't I open it? But you won't tell me why. And you're like, well, what does your character know? Like for me as a DM, that's how I play, right? If a player gets frustrated because I'm not letting them do something, I always point to what the character knows, right? Because I will tell them, that's why I don't mind telling a character it's impossible, but letting the player continue to try, because that's how real life works. Tell someone something is impossible. They don't just go, oh, okay. They're going to go try and they're going to learn a lesson. And I want my players to do that because their characters will do that. But it's when the players want to get, like, and I think a lot of DMs might be worried, like, well, what if I piss off a player, right? Like, they go too far and they're, like, mad because they can't accomplish it because I gave them all of these reasons they couldn't and they overcame them all. And it's like, but that's the idea. It's still not possible. But what did they learn getting through it? And if the player's still mad, then straight up, I'm going to tell all of you DMs, your player's entitled. Like, they're entitled players and entitled like DMs exist. But the fact is, if a player says they want something and gets mad when they can't have it, regardless of how little or how much effort they put in, if they get mad at you, DM, they're just fucking entitled. They wanted something and they thought that they were going to get, like in their mind, they were going to get it. It just depended on when. You know what I mean? That's entitlement that I don't want in my games. Yeah. If a player says, oh, I'm going to get this, oh, believe me, that you've already sealed the deal that you never will. Like, I guarantee you the moment that you find whatever it is you think you want and you pick it up, it's going to be a cursed object of not what you think it is. You know what I'm saying? Like, it won't ever happen because I don't play like that. I don't let my players control the world, like, control like a lot of things, but they don't control me as a DM like that. Yeah. And same thing with DMs. As a player, I don't like playing with DMs who are, DM ex machina everything. They just decide, oh, you guys are playing this battle too easily. I'm just going to add 5 more guys that I didn't plan on, but because you guys fought this too easily. Or, oh, I didn't want to TPK you in this fight, so random NPC to save you. Like, right. That makes no fucking sense. Like an NPC that, you literally boarded a ship that went west and then you traveled east and suddenly they're there in a way that's not even possible. You know what I mean? Like, just saying, like, there's just those things where I think that if you have those entitled people, it's not easy to deal with them, but I find it easier when you give them things they can't argue. You know what I mean? And like again, it's those little breadcrumbs, those little details, those little questions that I ask as a DM, like, are you sure? Or so let me get this straight. Like you've learned whenever I ask for confirmation, especially if I clarify, let me get this straight. This is what I heard that you're doing. It's usually not necessarily a bad reason, but it's usually because I'm gathering information on, I want the specifics. Everything you said mattered, right? Like your whole thing with your staff that in that one episode where it's like, so you put it down. You specifically said you put it down. And then I said to everybody, you guys get on your horse and you leave, but you never said you picked it back up. Stupid little shit like that, right? It's those little tiny details that we throw in. And for me as a DM, I feel like if I've done enough of those, if I've thrown enough breadcrumbs down, that is my fight against any player that wants to get, entitled about it. It's like, look, man, like the details were there. You just chose not to abide by them. You chose not to think about those details. And
Right.
you just wanted your entitlement. And, it's not easy, but when you can talk to them and explain to them and be like, well, you see when I said this, and you see when this happened, and you remember when you did this, and you basically walk them and make them verbally walk themselves into the situation and go, oh, okay, I just didn't think. And then what, 9 times out of 10, the argument that you always get, like the defeatist argument out of them when they're still frustrated is, I just didn't think it would be that. And it's like, that's your problem. You had an expectation coming into my game. And DMs, you can't be too, you don't be too arrogant about that. But it is your game. It is your rules. It is your it is your story. Everyone's part of the narrative of that story. Key difference. It's your story, but it's their narrative. So be strong on the story that you've created and the details and everything that you've created, but also understand that you have to make that narrative also work with the players, right? So if you take a little extra time to make sure that the narrative is on your side, they won't have anything to argue with. They'll just be upset that they were, because whenever I hear that, whenever they're like, oh, well, I just didn't think, or I thought this way, it's basically you either weren't paying attention or you didn't want to. You know what I mean? Like you didn't.
Yeah.
And that's all it is. It's not a bad thing. It's just it's telling me that you didn't want to pay attention to the details that we were given. You just had it in your head how it was. And it's never easy to make that separation between DMs and players because, again, there's a lot of different ways to go about taking those roles. Like I really like gaming sessions and gaming groups where the DM cycles, like everyone has a chance at being a DM. Yeah. I do like that. But, for those of you who have dedicated DMs, it's just, you got to learn, like we've talked about a lot on this channel, you just have to learn how best to work with everybody because it is a game everybody's playing and nobody can take, I basically want to say no one can take too much ownership, I think. Like I take full ownership of High Point. High Point, its lore and its details and its mechanics and the way it functions, 100% mine. Like no one can mess with that. Yeah. But when we're in game, I don't think taking too much ownership when you're actually playing is a good route to go because any one person like a DM taking too much ownership of this is my story, my campaign, and I want us to, railroad. I want us to go through these. That's too much ownership. Players being too entitled, taking too much ownership of, well, I wanted to do this and I don't want the story to progress just yet, or, everybody realizing that they're there for the betterment of everyone else and not just playing their own game, I think is the best approach, but you don't always see that. You do see some people coming into it kind of like a multiplayer, like Call of Duty game. Sometimes you get in there and everyone's communicative and everyone's playing with teamwork. And then other times you get in there and everyone's literally just in it for their own kills, just in it for their own score. They don't even care if they don't even care about the win. Like I've been in games where there are people on the team who don't even care about the objective. They don't care about winning the game. They just care about getting their own personal highest score. And it's like, dude, we lost. And they're like, yeah, but I did better than you. I did better than everyone in the room. And it's like, but you lost. It's like, but I did better than everyone. It's like, I can't deal with that, right? And that's where I call too much ownership because they're taking too much ownership of what they need to get accomplished and ignoring the fact that everybody else is a part of that game, right? They don't care that other people are not having fun with what they're doing because it's all amount to them. And I'm not saying that you have to give up what you have fun,
right? But
learn how to incorporate it. Have fun while letting others have fun. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. That's pretty much brought us to our 2-hour mark. I didn't have any other like major topics for tonight. I know it's kind of our like free night to talk. But like I'm kind of good with those.
No, that was definitely pretty solid. I like the hard and fast like ideas of how to help implement these things into a world that you've already created. Like there are certain like steps and ideas and paths you can take. So No, I think that was
Yeah.
that's very helpful, and
I know this will come up a lot more, and I want to give more examples as we do more homebrew review.
for sure.
Maybe in homebrew review episodes on Mondays, maybe we'll be able to add more discussion points about how to talking about the ripple effects of the butterfly effect,
Yeah.
and just see, talking more about when we implement things, how is that going to propagate into the history? Because I do like this topic. I think this was a good example today of coming up with something that I wanted to implement, and how I go about looking at what are the effects
Yeah.
overall, and where and what it'll affect. So yeah, the topic I want to continue talking on, but not specifically. I just want to add it as discussion points as we
Yep.
continue with homebrew review. But yeah, if that's everything there, I
cool.
think we are all good. So thank you everybody in chat for joining us. If you're joining us on YouTube, thank you so much. I hope you liked the video. If you do, go ahead and hit the like button. If not, hit the dislike button and let us know so we can always get better. I do hope you are subscribed. If you liked everything you saw here today and you missed anything, or if you want to see anything else that we've streamed, you can check out our live stream or our YouTube channel. All of our live streams are on there. I actually have been getting it wrong. It's at MisfitGamersStudios Live is actually the full YouTube channel. You can also
Okay,
catch
bet.
that on our Discord as well. We just did a major update on the YouTube channel as well, so we have all of the playlists now officially updated. All of the titles are
real
officially
cool.
updated on all of the channels, so at least it's a little bit easier to see and read. And again, this is just our lives channel. We'll eventually be able to make content channels in the future. But yeah, let us know what you guys think in the comments. Join our Discord if you haven't. You can submit ideas for us to talk about. You can submit homebrew review items for us to review on Mondays, or you can just sit there and chat with us and get to know us a little bit more and ask us questions, in the Discord about how we do things as DMs and as players. Otherwise, catch us on Mondays at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for D&D Discussions Homebrew Review, where we take review submissions from viewers like yourself, and we review them live on stream, let you know our initial thoughts, what we may or may not do with them, and then give them a rating based on how likely we would like to add them to our own settings. And then here on Fridays, starts at 7:30 Pacific Standard Time, and we just really talk about pretty much random individual topics that we'll just kind of deep dive into like today. So once again, thank you guys for joining us. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we will see you on Monday.
Deuces, my friends.